He was born in a quiet industrial town where most people worked with their hands but few were praised for how they used them. And from early childhood, he noticed that his fingers moved differently from others. Not faster or stronger but more curious, always exploring textures, edges, heat, resistance, and sound, as if his hands were asking questions his mouth never learned to ask. His name was Elias, the son of a factory electrician and a school cafeteria worker, and money was always tight enough to make every broken object feel like a small disaster. So when something cracked or stopped working, it was usually thrown away without discussion, because fixing things took time and mistakes cost more than replacements, or so everyone believed. Elias did not believe that even as a child. And when he was 7, he pulled apart a broken table fan that had been left beside the trash bins behind their apartment building, carrying it up the stairs in secret and spreading the pieces across the kitchen floor while his parents were still at work. And he touched every screw and wire slowly, not rushing, not forcing, just learning how each part felt and how it wanted to fit back with the others. When his mother came home and saw the mess, she shouted in fear more than anger, telling him not to touch it, telling him he could cut himself or break it more, telling him he had no idea what he was doing, and he stood there quietly while she swept the pieces back into a box. But later that night, he took the box from under the sink and stayed awake long after midnight putting the fan back together. And when he plugged it in and felt the soft push of air on his face, he smiled in a way he never forgot. That moment did not change his life overnight, but it planted something deep and steady inside him. A belief that things were not finished just because others gave up on them, and that his fingers understood patterns his eyes alone could not see. And from then on, he began collecting broken things the way other children collected toys. Old radios, snapped tools, cracked instruments, anything with parts that could be separated and studied. At school, he was quiet and average, not failing but not impressive either, and teachers often mistook his silence for lack of interest, while classmates thought he was strange for preferring the company of discarded objects over games and noise. And when group projects were assigned, he was usually left with the physical tasks, cutting, assembling, holding things steady. Jobs that required patience but earned little praise. By the time he reached his teenage years, his hands had grown strong and precise, marked by small scars and burns that told stories no one asked to hear. And his father warned him often to be careful, reminding him that hands were a worker's future and that one mistake could end everything, repeating the same phrase again and again. Do not touch what you do not understand. Ironically, it was that warning that followed Elias everywhere, echoing in classrooms, workshops, and later job sites, because people saw his curiosity as risk. And when machines jammed or systems failed, supervisors preferred to shut them down completely rather than let a quiet young man experiment with them. And each time he stepped back obediently, feeling the familiar frustration of being told to keep his hands still. After high school, he could not afford university, and even if he could, he did not know what he would study, because his skill did not fit neatly into a single subject. So he took a job at a small manufacturing plant on the edge of town, working long shifts loading parts and cleaning stations, always close to the machines but never allowed to adjust or repair them. The plant was old and constantly breaking down, and when it did, production stopped, alarms sounded, and managers rushed in with checklists and phone calls. And outside technicians were called at great expense, and Elias watched closely every time, memorizing how problems were diagnosed and solved, noticing patterns, remembering sounds and vibrations, storing knowledge quietly. One evening during a late shift, a critical machine jammed while a large order was being processed, and panic spread through the floor as supervisors argued about what to do. Because the technician would not arrive for hours, and the delay would cost the company heavily. And as usual, Elias was told to step away and not touch anything. He stood there listening to the uneven hum of the machine and felt a familiar pull in his hands, a sense that something small was out of place, something that wanted to be nudged rather than replaced. And without thinking too much, he reached forward, then stopped, remembering every warning he had ever heard, remembering how easily blame could fall on the person who acted without permission. For a long moment he did nothing, and that moment felt heavier than any mistake he could imagine. Because he knew he understood this machine in a way others did not because he was smarter, but because he had paid attention when no one was watching. And finally he raised his hand and asked quietly if he could try something. The room fell silent, and the supervisor looked at him with disbelief and irritation, asking what he thought he was doing, reminding him that he was not trained or authorized, and others nodded, repeating the familiar phrase, "Do not touch it." Elias lowered his hand, nodded, and stepped back, and the machine remained silent and useless. And in that stillness he felt a deep sadness, not anger but a sense of wasted possibility, as if a song had been cut off before reaching its chorus. That night he went home exhausted, his hands aching not from work but from restraint. And he lay awake thinking about all the times he had been told to stop, to wait, to leave things alone. And he wondered whether his gift, if that was what it was, would always remain hidden behind rules and fear. He did not know then that this moment of hesitation was the true beginning of his story, because it marked the point where his patience would soon be tested beyond comfort, where silence would no longer protect him, and where his fingers would finally be given a chance to show what they were capable of, not in secret, not at home in the dark, but in the open where consequences were real and impossible to avoid. The next morning, Elias returned to the factory with the same quiet posture, but something inside him had shifted. He moved through his tasks with care, yet his thoughts stayed fixed on the silence of the machine from the night before, the way it had waited as if it knew he could help it. And this time the feeling did not fade as the hours passed. During breaks, he began sketching the machine from memory on scrap paper. Not technical drawings, but simple shapes showing where parts pressed against each other and where friction could build unnoticed. And as he worked, he realized that no one had ever asked him what he saw or how he understood these systems. They only saw his job title and assumed his limits. Over the following days, more small failures happened across the plant. Nothing dramatic, but enough to slow production and raise tempers. And each time, Elias noticed the same pattern. Machines were treated like fragile mysteries instead of logical systems. And fear guided decisions more than observation. One afternoon, a senior technician finally noticed Elias watching closely during a repair and asked him why he was always staring at the machines. The question was not hostile, just tired. And Elias answered honestly, saying he liked understanding how things worked and how small changes could cause big problems. The technician laughed softly and told him curiosity was dangerous in places like this, explaining that companies cared more about avoiding blame than finding quiet solutions, and that touching the wrong thing could cost a job or worse. And Elias listened respectfully, even though the words felt like another door closing. Still, something unexpected happened after that conversation. The technician began letting Elias stand closer during repairs, explaining steps aloud more often. And while permission was never given directly, a thin line of trust began to form, fragile but real. One evening, when a conveyor system stuttered and stopped, the technician was delayed in another section of the plant, and the supervisor paced nervously, muttering about losses and deadlines. And for the first time, no one told Elias to step away. They simply ignored him. He took that silence as something different from refusal, and slowly he knelt beside the machine, listening to it the way one listens to a person breathing unevenly. He placed his hand against the metal housing and felt a subtle vibration that told him where the problem lived. With careful movements, he adjusted a small misaligned guide rail, not forcing it, just easing it back into balance. And when the system restarted smoothly, the sound filled the room like relief, and several workers stared at him in surprise. The supervisor asked what he had done, and Elias explained calmly using simple words. And no one argued because the machine was running and the work was moving again. And in that moment, something important changed, not loudly but permanently. For the rest of the shift, people looked at him differently. Not with admiration yet, but with curiosity, and Elias felt a mix of pride and fear, knowing that once you are seen, you can no longer hide. And that touching something successfully can be more dangerous than failing. As he walked home that night, his hands felt steady and alive, and he understood that his story was no longer just about secret skill. It was now about whether he would be brave enough to keep using it when the risks became real. Word spread quietly through the factory over the next few weeks. Not through announcements or praise, but through small glances and changed behavior. People began stepping aside when a machine made a strange sound, and someone would say maybe Elias should look at it, half joking but half serious. And each time he felt the weight of expectations settle a little heavier on his shoulders. Management never officially changed his role, but the senior technician continued allowing him closer access, sometimes asking his opinion in a low voice as if afraid the walls might hear. And Elias answered carefully, never claiming certainty, always explaining what he felt and noticed rather than what he thought should be done. With every small success, his confidence grew, not loud confidence but a quiet trust in his own senses, and his hands became his language. They moved with calm purpose, responding to resistance and rhythm, and people started to notice that machines seemed gentler when he worked on them, as if they relaxed under his touch. Not everyone was pleased by this change. A few supervisors saw him as a risk, someone who did not follow the usual chain of command, and whispers began that if something went wrong, it would be easy to blame the young worker who liked to experiment. And Elias sensed this tension even when no one spoke it aloud. One afternoon, a complex machine failed in a way no one had seen before. Production halted completely. Alarms rang. And this time the problem was serious enough to draw upper management onto the floor, suits standing awkwardly among grease and noise, and the mood was sharp with pressure. The technician examined the machine and shook his head, saying it would take hours to diagnose, and an outside specialist was already being called. And as everyone prepared for a long shutdown, several workers looked toward Elias without realizing they were doing it. He felt his heart race, because this machine was different, more complicated, with risks that could not be undone. And he knew that if he touched it now and failed, there would be no quiet recovery, but he also felt that familiar pull. The sense that the problem was not chaos, but a simple miscommunication between parts. For a moment he considered stepping back, protecting himself, staying within the boundaries that had kept him safe until now. But then he remembered the wasted silence of the night when he had obeyed and done nothing, and he knew he could not repeat that choice. He spoke up clearly, asking if he could try something before the specialist arrived, and the room went still, eyes shifting between him and the managers, and after a long pause one of them nodded, not out of trust but out of desperation. Elias approached the machine slowly, feeling the seriousness of the moment in every breath. And he placed his hands on the structure with respect, not rushing, not forcing, listening through touch the way he always had. And within minutes he identified a tension imbalance, caused by a minor calibration error. He adjusted it with careful precision, step by step, explaining as he worked so others could follow. And when the machine restarted successfully, the relief was immediate and undeniable. Work resumed, alarms fell silent, and for the first time applause broke out on the factory floor. Elias stood there overwhelmed, not by pride but by the realization that his hands had crossed a line. There was no going back to being invisible. And as managers approached him with new interest, he understood that recognition carried its own kind of danger. Because once people see magic, they expect it every time. That day marked the end of his anonymity and the beginning of a harder journey, one where skill would no longer be hidden and mistakes would be watched closely. And as he left the factory, he felt both taller and more exposed than ever before. After that day, the atmosphere around Elias changed in ways he could feel even without looking up. Conversations lowered when he passed. Managers began watching him longer than necessary, and coworkers asked him questions that were not really questions but tests, each one quietly asking how far his ability went and where it might fail. He was given more access but not more protection, which meant he touched more machines but carried more responsibility without a title to match it. And this imbalance created a quiet pressure that followed him home every night, settling into his hands even when they rested. Requests came faster than he expected. A jammed press, a misaligned cutter, a sensor error no one could explain. And each time he helped, the relief was immediate but short-lived, because relief quickly turned into expectation. And expectation hardened into demand. One supervisor began assigning him tasks outside his original role without documenting anything. Another warned him privately that if something went wrong, there would be no record of permission. And Elias understood the message clearly. He was valuable only when things worked and expendable the moment they did not. At home, his parents noticed the change before he spoke about it. His hands moved even during conversation, fingers pressing against each other as if solving invisible problems. And when his father asked what was happening, Elias answered simply that people were finally letting him fix things. His father grew quiet and told him again to be careful, reminding him that workplaces loved results but hated responsibility, and that talent without authority often paid the highest price. And though Elias nodded, he felt something stronger than fear growing inside him. A refusal to shrink back into silence. One night, a serious incident occurred when a machine he had adjusted earlier malfunctioned again under heavy load. Alarms sounded and panic spread. And although the issue was unrelated to his work, his name was spoken quickly and sharply, and he was called in to explain himself. He stood in a small office facing managers who wanted certainty he could not give. And he explained calmly what he had done and what he had not done. But doubt filled the room because certainty is easier than truth. And for the first time, Elias felt the sharp edge of being known. After hours of inspection, the cause was found and it had nothing to do with him. Apologies were brief and uncomfortable, and no one met his eyes afterward. And Elias realized that skill could attract blame just as easily as praise. Instead of retreating, he made a decision that night. He would no longer work only by instinct and memory. He began documenting everything he touched. Writing down adjustments, observations, and outcomes in a simple notebook he carried everywhere, not to prove himself but to protect himself. This habit changed how he worked, slowing him down but sharpening his awareness. And over time, others began to rely on his notes, asking to see what he had written, and slowly, without announcement, his notebook became part of the workflow. Elias did not feel like a hero or a miracle worker. He felt like someone learning to stand in the open after years of working in the dark. And he understood that the real challenge ahead was not fixing machines, but surviving a system that did not know how to handle someone whose hands spoke louder than hierarchy. As he closed the notebook one evening at the end of a long shift, he felt the weight of what was coming. Not disaster or triumph, but change. And he knew that once fingers show what they can do, the world will either make space for them or try to bind them again. The pressure that followed Elias into the following months did not explode all at once, but pressed steadily like weight added grain by grain. And with every successful repair, the space around him narrowed, because people stopped asking if he could help and started assuming he would. And when something failed, the first reaction was no longer panic, but expectation directed squarely at him. His notebook grew thicker and his handwriting tighter, every entry a small shield against misunderstanding. Yet even documentation could not protect him from the unspoken rule that skill without rank must always prove itself again. And he learned quickly that consistency was demanded, but forgiveness was not guaranteed. A turning point came during a major contract rush when the factory pushed machines beyond their usual limits. Heat rose, tolerances shrank, and mistakes multiplied, and Elias found himself moving constantly from one station to another, barely stopping long enough to drink water. His hands doing the work his voice could not slow. Late one evening, a newly installed machine failed catastrophically. Not with noise, but with sudden silence, production froze and the room felt hollow. And this time the issue was unfamiliar even to Elias, something he had not touched before and something no one truly understood yet. All eyes turned to him again, and he felt a sharp pull between honesty and expectation. Because for the first time, his hands did not immediately know the answer. And the fear was not of failure, but of being exposed as human after being treated like a solution. He took a breath and said he needed time. Not minutes, but real time, and the room reacted badly. Supervisors exchanged looks, schedules were mentioned, losses were calculated aloud. And the quiet agreement that had protected him before began to crack. Still he stood firm and refused to rush, explaining that guessing would be worse than waiting. And for a long tense stretch nothing happened except arguments and phone calls. Until finally management agreed to pause rather than risk greater damage. Elias spent hours with the machine, not touching at first, just listening and observing, reading manuals others ignored, comparing notes. And when he finally placed his hands on it, he did so with humility rather than confidence, moving slowly and stopping often. The solution came not as a sudden insight, but as a layered understanding. And when the machine finally returned to life, it did so quietly and steadily, without celebration. And that quiet success changed something deeper than applause ever had. From that night on, Elias was no longer seen as magic but as reliable. And reliability carried a different kind of respect. One that did not ask for miracles but trusted process. And though the pressure did not vanish, it became more honest. He went home exhausted yet calm, knowing he had crossed another line. Not by proving himself again, but by setting a boundary. And for the first time, he understood that true mastery was not just knowing when to touch something, but knowing when not to. After that night, Elias noticed a subtle shift in how people approached him. The urgency in their voices softened and questions replaced commands. And while expectations still existed, they now came with pauses that allowed him to think rather than react. Management finally adjusted his role on paper. Not with celebration, but with quiet practicality, giving him responsibility without pretending it was a favor. And this change brought relief mixed with a new kind of weight. Because now success and failure would both belong to him openly. With formal recognition came formal limits, safety meetings, procedures, and layers of approval that slowed everything down. And while some workers complained, Elias understood the value of these barriers, because they created space where mistakes could be discussed instead of hidden. He began mentoring younger workers who reminded him of himself. Curious but cautious, and instead of telling them what to do, he showed them how to listen to machines. How sound, vibration, and resistance told stories long before alarms sounded. Not every lesson worked and not every student stayed patient, but those who did began solving problems on their own. And Elias felt something unexpected grow inside him, a quiet pride not in being needed, but in being less needed. Outside the factory, his life remained simple. No sudden wealth or dramatic change. Just steady routines and evenings spent resting his hands rather than pushing them. And in that calm, he reflected on how close he had come to being crushed by attention. One afternoon, a regional manager visited and watched Elias work for a long time without speaking. And when asked what made him different, Elias answered honestly that he paid attention longer than most people were willing to. And that answer stayed with the manager. Soon after, the company began changing how it trained technicians, slowing the process and emphasizing observation over speed. And while Ilya's name was never mentioned directly, he could see his influence spreading quietly through the system. The phrase "do not touch it" slowly disappeared from daily language, replaced by questions like "what do you notice" and "what does it feel like now?" And hearing those words made Elias realize that the magic people once saw in his fingers had always been simple care practiced without fear. As months passed, he felt less like an exception and more like part of something larger. A shift in how work was understood, and he knew that even if he left tomorrow, the change would continue. Standing alone one evening after a long shift, he rested his hands on a silent machine and felt gratitude rather than tension, knowing that the real transformation was not in what his fingers could do, but in how the world had finally learned to let them move time past in a way Elias had never experienced before, not rushed and not stagnant but steady. And with that steadiness came moments of doubt that were quieter yet deeper than the fear he once felt. Because now he had space to think about what kind of future he wanted rather than simply surviving each shift. He began to notice how often people tied their identity to urgency, how problems created purpose for them. And as systems improved and breakdowns became rarer, some workers felt uneasy, unsure of their value without constant crisis. And Elias understood this feeling more than he expected. There were days when machines ran smoothly from start to finish and no one needed him at all. And instead of relief, he felt an odd emptiness. A question forming slowly inside him about whether his worth still existed when his hands were still. To answer that question, he turned his attention inward and outward at the same time, reflecting on his own habits while observing how others worked. And he realized that the true change was not technical but emotional. People were learning patience in a place that once rewarded panic. He started spending time after shifts writing not just notes about machines, but reflections about choices. Moments when rushing had caused harm and moments when waiting had saved effort. And these writings were never shared officially, yet they shaped how he spoke and taught. A difficult moment came when a longtime coworker made a costly mistake and expected Elias to quietly fix it. But this time Elias refused to cover it up, choosing honesty over comfort. And though the decision strained their relationship, it protected the larger trust that had been built. That refusal weighed on him for weeks, because loyalty and integrity rarely align easily, and he questioned whether his growth meant becoming colder, until he saw how openly mistakes were discussed afterward, and how blame slowly gave way to learning. Elias understood then that his journey was no longer about proving his ability, but about protecting the culture that allowed ability to exist without fear. And this responsibility felt heavier than any machine he had ever touched. As he walked through the factory one evening, listening to the balanced hum of systems working as intended, he felt something close to peace. Not the excitement of being needed, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that even in his absence, the work would continue with care and awareness. Satisfaction of knowing that even in his absence, the work would continue with care and awareness. The calm that settled over Elias' life was not perfect or permanent. And part 8 began with a challenge that did not come from machines, but from people outside the factory who wanted to claim what they had seen growing quietly inside it. A consulting firm heard about the changes in workflow and efficiency and sent representatives who spoke in polished language about optimization and scaling. And when they met Elias, they treated him like a discovery rather than a person, asking him to demonstrate how he worked as if his skill could be extracted and packaged. They suggested faster methods, shortcuts that promised results without the patience he valued, and Elias listened respectfully but felt a familiar warning rise in his chest. The same feeling he had as a child when someone told him not to touch something without understanding it. Management was tempted by the numbers and the promise of recognition, and Elias felt caught between loyalty to the place that had finally trusted him and the fear that rushing this culture would break what had taken years to grow. In meetings, he spoke carefully, explaining that the strength of the system came from time and attention, not from him alone, and that removing fear was more important than increasing speed. And though not everyone agreed, his honesty slowed decisions long enough for reflection. Some changes were tested and failed quietly, proving his concerns without argument. And slowly, the excitement around turning his approach into a product faded, leaving behind a deeper respect for the limits of replication. Elias learned during this period that protecting something valuable often meant disappointing people who wanted quick success. And that saying no carried its own kind of courage. By the end of this chapter, he felt steadier than before, understanding that his role was not to expand endlessly but to remain grounded, and that the true magic of his fingers had always been restraint guided by care rather than ambition. By the time part 9 unfolded, Elias no longer measured his days by problems solved, but by how little fear he felt when walking onto the factory floor. And that absence of fear was something he protected carefully, because he knew how fragile it had once been. An unexpected opportunity arrived when the company announced a gradual modernization plan that would replace many old machines with newer systems. And while others celebrated the future, Elias felt a quiet concern, because new machines often came with sealed parts and strict rules that discouraged touch and understanding. Training sessions were scheduled with external instructors who focused on screens and procedures rather than physical awareness. And Elias noticed younger workers becoming anxious again, afraid to make mistakes and hesitant to ask questions. And he recognized the old silence returning in different form. Instead of opposing the change, he chose to adapt his approach, sitting with the new systems longer than required, learning their behavior and limits, and translating digital signals into physical meaning that others could grasp, bridging the gap between old instincts and new tools. There was resistance at first from those who believed modern systems removed the need for intuition. But small successes accumulated as Elias showed how understanding feel and feedback could prevent issues before software detected them. During this transition, he realized that his journey had prepared him not just for one environment, but for change itself, and that his true skill was not tied to any specific machine, but to attention and respect applied consistently. One evening after a successful upgrade, he stood beside a new machine running smoothly, and felt the same quiet satisfaction he once felt with the old broken fan. And he understood that the magic people spoke about had never been in the past or the future, but in the willingness to engage fully with what was present. As this phase closed, Elias felt ready for whatever came next, not because he had mastered everything, but because he trusted his hands and his judgment enough to meet uncertainty without retreating into silence. In the final part, Elias reached a place he once believed did not exist, a balance between caution and courage, between listening and acting, where his hands no longer felt like something he had to defend or prove. The factory no longer defined him completely, and neither did his skill, because he had learned that identity built only on usefulness could vanish the moment circumstances changed. And this understanding gave him a calm independence. When younger workers asked him how he learned to do what he did not speak about talent or instinct. He spoke about patience, about paying attention when others rushed past, about respecting systems instead of fighting them. And these words carried more weight than any demonstration. There came a day when a major decision had to be made about his future. An offer to move into management or to stay close to the work itself. And after careful thought, he chose a path that allowed him to remain grounded, guiding quietly rather than directing loudly. People expected disappointment or ambition and were surprised by his contentment. But Elias knew that fulfillment did not come from climbing higher, but from standing where his values stayed intact. As time moved forward, his presence became less noticeable yet more influential. Problems were solved earlier. Fear continued to fade, and the culture he had helped shape began sustaining itself without constant effort. He sometimes thought back to the boy holding a broken fan on a kitchen floor, told not to touch what he did not understand. And he smiled at how far that moment had traveled through his life. The magic was never sudden or loud. It was built through thousands of careful choices, through restraint as much as action, and through the courage to stay present even when silence felt safer. And so his story did not end with applause or legend. It ended with something quieter and stronger. A life where his fingers moved freely, not because they were special, but because the world around him finally learned how to let care lead instead of fear.